Welcome back. Today, we're diving into a brand new explainer, breaking down an absolutely monumental event, the historic May 2026 Trump-Xi summit over in Beijing. We're talking about an unprecedented 48 hours that are quite literally resetting the global geopolitical chessboard right before our eyes. The whole dynamic between the world's two largest powers, well, it's just taken a massive, completely unexpected turn, and we're going to look at the exact data and decisions driving the whole thing.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to map out this new global order in 5 steps. First, the Beijing corporate coup. Second, the American debt trap. Then, the Thucydides trap. Fourth, China's 4 red lines. And finally, number 5, the global resistance.
Now, to really understand just how bizarre and frankly how desperate this summit is, you got to consider this incredibly jarring event that happened right at the beginning. Imagine being the top diplomat of the United States, right? But to even enter your biggest rival's capital, you have to use a technical loophole. Because the U.S. Secretary of State had actually been previously blacklisted by Beijing. Reports are showing he had to use a modified identity just to be allowed to land for these talks. I mean, that is a staggering concession right out of the gate, and it totally sets the tone for the entire visit.
So that brings us to part 1, the Beijing corporate coup and Air Force One's billionaire cargo. You see, President Trump didn't just bring a bunch of diplomats on Air Force One. He brought an absolute army of global CEOs. We're talking Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Jensen Huang, Kelly Ortberg, plus 13 other top-level executives who all made the trip. So why are they there? Well, it's simple. A full U.S.-China decoupling threatens literally trillions in profits. These CEOs are effectively acting as, well, human shields and bargaining chips. They're trying to secure their supply chains while simultaneously offering China continued access to top-tier American technological partnerships. And the sheer lengths the administration went to just to secure this corporate lineup, it's wild. The presidential aircraft actually made a mid-flight detour up to Alaska, specifically to pick up NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang. Now, NVIDIA's valuation has recently skyrocketed past $5 trillion, which makes their semiconductor and AI technology absolutely crucial to all of this. The administration knew they absolutely needed him at that negotiating table. It really illustrates this intense desperation to safeguard those vital tech supply chains. And the stakes here are astronomically high. We're looking at potential agreements like a staggering $900 billion deal for Boeing to sell a massive fleet of 737 MAX and wide-body planes directly to China. This is a highly calculated attempt to patch up a glaring $200 billion U.S. trade deficit. The whole goal is to sell these massive high-value products to try and offset the huge volume of cheaper goods flowing in the other direction.
Which leads into part 2, the American debt trap. This is the vulnerability that's really driving the deal.
Now take a look at this number, because it is sending absolute shockwaves through global finance. 5.046%. That is the yield buyers recently demanded for 30-year U.S. Treasury bonds. For the very first time since 2007, that 5% threshold was breached. This signals a massive, fundamental shift. Basically, the era of America's free lunch, the ability to just borrow endless amounts of money at rock-bottom interest rates, that's ending. The global market is now demanding a higher risk premium. And here's why that matters to you. When the U.S. government has to pay more to borrow money, that cascades all the way down, driving up the cost of everyday things like your mortgages and your personal loans. And here is the brutal math behind that risk. Annual U.S. interest payments on its debt, they've just crossed the $1 trillion mark. Let's put that into perspective for a second. The United States is now spending more money just paying the interest on its past borrowing than it spends on its entire national defense budget. It's crazy. This is being fueled by a gross national debt of over $31.27 trillion, which officially surpasses the nation's total GDP. So the crucial takeaway here is this really stark contrast in leverage. On one side, you have a major U.S. crisis, an exploding debt burden that's severely exacerbated by the financial drain of the ongoing conflict in Iran, which is actually threatening the stability of the petrodollar itself. But then, on the other side, look at China's leverage. They aren't just selling cheap goods anymore, right? They are dominating the electric vehicle market, and they firmly control 70% of the world's rare earth minerals. And those minerals, they are absolutely essential for everything from American consumer tech right up to our advanced defense systems.
Moving on to Section 3, the Thucydides trap. This is a very real warning from history. During the summit, President Xi actually explicitly brought up something called the Thucydides trap. Now, if you aren't familiar, this is a geopolitical concept based on ancient history. It basically suggests that when a rising power, in this case, China, threatens to displace an established power, like the US, conflict is highly, highly likely. So by bringing this up, Xi's message to Washington was crystal clear. Accept that you are no longer the sole, unchallenged superpower and allow for a peaceful transfer of influence, or risk a completely catastrophic global war. And this brilliantly illustrates how we can see this warning play out by just looking at the last great empire transition. Check this out. Before World War I, the British Empire had a pretty modest 30% debt to GDP ratio. But by the end of World War II, fighting global conflicts had pushed that debt up to 250%. That massive financial insolvency forced them to rely heavily on the US, which ultimately led to the collapse of their global influence, perfectly marked by the 1956 Suez Crisis. Our sources are pointing out that the US is currently tracing this exact same trajectory of imperial overstretch.
All right, on to part 4, China's 4 red lines and how they are dictating the terms.
Literally, right as the US delegation was flying in, the Chinese embassy laid out 4 strict, non-negotiable demands. First, zero discussion regarding the sovereignty of Taiwan. Second, the US must drop all demands regarding democracy and human rights. Third, Washington has to respect China's distinct political system. And finally, the US must not interfere with China's developmental and economic rights. So, in short, no more lectures and no more tariffs. China is calling the shots here.
And the immediate result of those demands? An eerie silence. While walking side by side with President Xi, President Trump notably ignored multiple direct questions from reporters regarding Taiwan. On top of that, a highly anticipated $11 billion U.S. weapons package intended for Taiwan has remained completely stalled. This implies a massive strategic calculation on the U.S. side, potentially sacrificing the defense of the island to secure an economic lifeline and hopefully end conflicts elsewhere. And that points to a much grander strategy, something analysts are actually calling a reverse Nixon. Think back to 1972, when President Nixon allied with China specifically to isolate the Soviet Union. Well, now, in 2026, the U.S. appears to be offering these massive trade and tech concessions to China to try and lure them away from their no-limits partnership with Russia. A successful U.S.-China deal, that is Moscow's worst nightmare, because it could severely isolate Russia and essentially dictate the end of ongoing conflicts in Eastern Europe.
Finally, Section 5, the global resistance, where the middle powers make their move.
So as the two superpowers start carving out their respective spheres of influence, with the US sort of handling the West and China taking the East, other nations are absolutely terrified of just being swallowed up. We're actually seeing the rise of a brand new non-aligned movement. As this quote perfectly notes, middle powers are making a Middle East pivot to ensure they maintain their strategic autonomy, so they don't just become mere pawns in this new US-China axis.
You can see this super clearly with India's response. While the U.S. delegation was busy in Beijing, the Indian Prime Minister was over in Abu Dhabi, aggressively securing the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC. Since traditional alliances like the Quad are kind of falling silent right now, India is quickly partnering with the UAE. They want to ensure that even if the big superpowers control the Pacific, the middle powers are still going to control the incredibly vital energy and trade routes flowing right through the Arabian Sea.
And this isn't just an isolated event either. A very distinct bloc of middle powers is forming before our eyes. Countries like India, the UAE, France, Germany, and Australia, they're all realizing they have to band together. They are actively pushing back against a world that's divided purely into American and Chinese spheres of influence. They're fighting for a multipolar world where they can keep their independent economic and strategic leverage. For you and me, this means the very supply chains bringing everyday goods to our doors are actively being rerouted as all these global alliances shift.
Okay, so let's bring this all together. The 2026 Beijing summit is, without a doubt, a definitive global reset. We've just watched a debt-burdened U.S. make some truly extraordinary corporate and diplomatic concessions. We've seen a highly assertive China dictating strict, non-negotiable red lines, and we're watching a massive scramble by global middle powers to secure their own lifelines. The entire geopolitical landscape has profoundly shifted in a mere 48 hours. Which leaves us with this final, absolutely critical question to ponder. As we rapidly move toward a G2 world that's heavily dictated by this new US-China arrangement, who really controls the future? Is it the two massive superpowers negotiating up at the top? Or is it those rapidly aligning middle powers who actually hold the critical resources in the global trade routes?
Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions, and I'll see you next time.